My grandfather's mind was disappearing piece by piece, but there was one thing dementia couldn't take from him: a name. Richard Hartwell, 1247 Pine Drive. He'd whisper over and over, like a prayer or a curse. We thought it was just confusion. We had no idea it was the key to a 50-year-old betrayal that had stolen his entire life's work. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, what's a memory that's stuck with you your whole life? And if stories about justice, family secrets, and setting the record straight speak to you, follow this page so you don't miss the next one. The Sunset Manor Care Facility smelled like disinfectant and resignation. I visited my grandfather every Tuesday and Thursday, watching dementia steal him away one memory at a time. Eddie Morrison had been a brilliant man, a mechanic who could fix anything, an inventor who saw solutions where others saw problems. Now he sat in a wheelchair by the window, staring at birds he couldn't name. Most days, he didn't recognize me. But there was one thing that never changed, one phrase that cut through the fog of his failing mind like a lighthouse beam. Richard Hartwell, 1247 Pine Drive. He'd say it during meals, whisper it during his afternoon naps, repeat it to the nurses who tried to redirect his attention. Always the same name, always the same address, delivered with an urgency that made my chest tight. "Who is Richard Hartwell, Grandpa?" I'd ask, but he'd just look at me with those cloudy blue eyes and say it again. Richard Hartwell, 1247 Pine Drive. The staff assured us it was normal. Dementia patients often fixate on random information, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our family meetings. Names from TV, addresses they've seen on mail, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But my mother, Eddie's daughter, wasn't convinced. He's never been random about anything in his life. Even now, even like this, there's intention behind it. I agreed. My grandfather had been methodical, purposeful. Even in his confusion, this felt important. The way he said the name. Not like he was trying to remember it, but like he was trying to tell us something. After 3 months of hearing the same phrase, I decided to investigate. I pulled out my laptop in the facility's family room and searched Richard Hartwell, 1247 Pine Drive. The results made me blink twice. Richard Hartwell wasn't just anyone. He was the founder and CEO of Hartwell Toys, one of the largest toy companies in the world. The man behind Wonder Blocks, those colorful interlocking building blocks that had been a childhood staple for generations. The same blocks I'd played with, that my mother had played with, that kids around the world still played with today. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the address. 1247 Pine Drive was real, a mansion in the hills outside the city, worth an estimated $12 million. Richard Hartwell's private residence. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. My grandfather, a simple mechanic from the wrong side of town, somehow knew the home address of a billionaire toy mogul, a man who, according to his Wikipedia page, was notoriously private and rarely gave interviews. "Mom," I called, walking over to where she sat with my grandfather. "I found him. Richard Hartwell. He's real." She looked up from the crossword puzzle she'd been pretending to work on. "What do you mean, real?" I showed her the search results on my phone. Her face went pale as she read. That can't be right. Dad never mentioned knowing anyone famous. But as we sat there, my grandfather looked directly at us for the first time in weeks. His eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in months. "Richard Hartwell," he said, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was an accusation. 1247 Pine Drive. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about Richard Hartwell. Born in 1951, the same year as my grandfather. Started Hartwell Toys in 1975 with his revolutionary Wonder Blocks design. Built a billion-dollar empire from a single product that had somehow captured the imagination of children worldwide. The official story was that Hartwell had invented Wonder Blocks in his college dorm room, inspired by watching children struggle with traditional building blocks that didn't connect properly. He'd patented the interlocking design and licensed it to a major toy manufacturer, using the profits to start his own company. But the more I read, the more questions I had. Hartwell had been a business major in college, not an engineering student. His background was in marketing and finance, not product design. How had someone with no technical training created such an innovative toy? I found old interviews from the 1980s where Hartwell seemed uncomfortable discussing the invention process. When pressed for details about how he developed the interlocking mechanism, his answers were vague, almost evasive. Innovation comes from seeing problems differently, he'd said in a 1987 Forbes article. I saw children frustrated with blocks that wouldn't stay together, and I found a solution. But he never explained what that solution was, or how he'd engineered it. I decided to visit the local library and dig through old newspapers from 1974 and 1975, the years before Wonder Blocks hit the market. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had a feeling there was more to the story. In the archives, I found something interesting. A small article in the business section of the local paper from March 1975. Local inventors seek backing for revolutionary toy design. The article was brief, just 3 paragraphs, but it mentioned 2 men working together on an innovative building block system. Edward Morrison, a local mechanic and inventor, has partnered with business student Richard Hartwell to develop a new type of children's building block that promises to revolutionize the toy industry. Edward Morrison. My grandfather. The article went on to say that the pair was seeking investors for their interlocking block system and had already filed a provisional patent. It mentioned that Morrison had developed the technical design while Hartwell handled the business side of the partnership. I stared at the microfilm screen, my heart pounding. My grandfather hadn't just known Richard Hartwell, they'd been partners. They'd invented Wonder Blocks together. But if that was true, what had happened? Why was Hartwell credited as the sole inventor? Why had my grandfather spent his life as a struggling mechanic while his former partner became a billionaire? I printed the article and drove straight to Sunset Manor. My grandfather was in his usual spot by the window, but when I sat down beside him and showed him the newspaper clipping, something changed in his face. Richard Hartwell, he said, but this time his voice was different. Sad. Betrayed. Grandpa, I said gently, did you and Richard invent something together? He looked at me, and for a moment the fog lifted completely. He said, he took it. He took everything. Then the moment passed, and he was gone again, lost in the maze of his feeling mind. But I'd heard enough. Richard Hartwell hadn't just known my grandfather, he'd stolen from him. 1247 Pine Drive was everything I'd expected and more. The mansion sat behind iron gates at the end of a winding driveway, all glass and stone and carefully manicured gardens. It was the kind of house that whispered money so old and established, it didn't need to shout. I'd called ahead claiming to be a journalist researching the history of Wonder Blocks for a retrospective article. Hartwell's assistant had been polite but firm. Mr. Hartwell didn't give interviews. But when I mentioned that I had information about the original invention process, something that might interest him, she'd agreed to pass along the message. The callback came within an hour. Richard Hartwell himself, his voice gravelly with age, agreeing to see me that afternoon. Now I stood at his front door, my grandfather's name and address written on a piece of paper in my pocket like a talisman. The door opened before I could knock. Richard Hartwell was 83 years old, but he carried himself like a man 20 years younger. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, but there was something else there too, something that looked like fear. "Ms. Morrison," he said, extending a hand. "Please, come in." He led me through a foyer that could house my entire apartment, past walls lined with awards and photographs of him with celebrities and politicians. But what caught my attention were the display cases filled with toys, every iteration of Wonder Blocks ever produced, from the original wooden prototypes to the latest high-tech versions. "Impressive collection," I said. "50 years of innovation," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Would you like some coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be great." He led me to a sitting room overlooking the gardens and poured coffee from an expensive-looking service. His hands, I noticed, were shaking slightly. "So, you mentioned you had information about the original invention process. I have to say, I'm curious what you think you've discovered that hasn't already been documented." I pulled out the newspaper clipping and set it on the coffee table between us. "I found this in the library archives." Hartwell leaned forward to read it, and I watched the color drain from his face. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Where did you say you were from?" he asked quietly. I didn't, but my name is Sophie Morrison. Edward Morrison was my grandfather. Hartwell's eyes snapped open. "Eddie's granddaughter. You remember him?" It wasn't a question, and Hartwell didn't treat it like one. He stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to me. "How is he?" he asked. "Dying. Dementia. But he remembers you. He says your name and this address over and over like it's the only thing left in his mind that matters." Hartwell's shoulders sagged. "I wondered if he would. Remember, I mean. I hoped he'd forgotten." "Forgotten what?" He turned around and I saw that his eyes were wet. "Everything. What we built together. What I took from him. What I did." The admission hung in the air between us like a confession waiting to be heard. "Tell me," I said. Richard Hartwell poured himself a scotch with hands that shook more than they had when he'd served coffee. He didn't offer me one. This wasn't a social drink. This was liquid courage for a story he'd been carrying for 50 years. "Your grandfather was the smartest man I ever met," he began, settling back into his chair. "I was a business student at the university, working part-time at a toy store downtown. Eddie came in one day with his daughter, your mother, I suppose, looking for building blocks for her birthday." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "The blocks we had were terrible. Wooden things that barely stayed together, plastic ones that broke if you looked at them wrong. Eddie started talking about how he could design something better, something that would actually connect and hold. I was intrigued. Here was this mechanic talking about engineering principles like he had a PhD. Hartwell took a sip of his scotch and stared out the window. We started meeting at his garage. He had this workshop in the back, full of tools and half-finished inventions. The man could build anything. He showed me sketches he'd made for an interlocking block system, precise drawings with measurements and angles that would allow the blocks to connect securely but still come apart easily. "The Wonder Blocks design," I said. "The foundation of it, yes. But Eddie's vision was bigger than just blocks. He wanted to create an entire system, blocks of different sizes and shapes, all compatible, all designed to spark creativity in children. He had prototypes made from wood, then plastic. We spent months testing them, refining the design." Hartwell's voice grew quieter. "I was supposed to handle the business side. I had connections from school, professors who knew people in the toy industry. Eddie trusted me to represent our partnership fairly. But you didn't." "No." The word came out like a physical pain. "A major toy company expressed interest. They wanted to meet with us, discuss licensing the design, but they were only available on a day when Eddie couldn't make it. His daughter was in the hospital with pneumonia. I remembered my mother telling me about being sick as a child, how my grandfather had never left her side. He asked me to go alone to present our proposal and report back. He trusted me completely. Hartwell's laugh was bitter. That trust was the biggest mistake of his life. What did you do? I went to the meeting. I brought the prototypes, the designs, everything. But when they asked about my partner, I panicked. These were serious businessmen talking about serious money, and I was just a college kid. I was afraid they'd think I wasn't capable of handling a major deal if I had to split decisions with someone else. He finished his scotch in one gulp. So I told them Eddie was just a consultant I'd hired to help with the technical aspects, that the invention was mine, that I was the sole owner of the intellectual property. They believed me. Why wouldn't they? I had all the documentation, all the prototypes. And my grandfather never knew? I told him the company had passed on our proposal, that they weren't interested. He was disappointed, but not surprised. He'd been turned down before. I said we should keep working, keep trying other companies, while you were secretly negotiating a deal. The contract was signed within a month, exclusive licensing rights, with royalties that would make me rich beyond my wildest dreams. All I had to do was provide the final technical specifications and oversee the initial production run, using my grandfather's designs. Every detail, every measurement, every innovation that made Wonderblock special, it all came from Eddie's brilliant mind. I just put my name on it. I felt sick. What happened when the blocks hit the market? Eddie saw them in a store window, called me, saying someone had stolen our design. He wanted to sue, to fight for our rights. I told him it would be impossible to prove, that these things happened all the time in the toy industry. I convinced him to let it go. And he believed you. He trusted me. Even after I betrayed him in the worst possible way, he still trusted my judgment about the business world. He thought I was looking out for both of us. Hartwell stood up and walked to one of the display cases, staring at the original Wonderblock's prototype, my grandfather's prototype. The worst part was watching him struggle. Eddie kept inventing, kept trying to create the next big thing, but he never had another breakthrough like the blocks. He'd bring me his new ideas, ask for my help getting them to market, and every time I'd find reasons why they wouldn't work, why companies wouldn't be interested. You sabotaged him. I was protecting myself. If Eddie became successful with another invention, if he got attention in the toy industry, someone might start asking questions about Wonderblocks. Someone might notice the similarities to his earlier work. I stood up, anger flooding through me. So you kept him down. You kept him poor and struggling while you built an empire on his work? Yes. The admission was barely a whisper. I destroyed the best man I ever knew to protect a lie. Why are you telling me this now? Hartwell turned to face me, and I saw that tears were streaming down his face. Because I'm dying too, cancer, 6 months, maybe less. And because for 50 years, every time I've looked at a Wonderblock, every time I've seen a child playing with them, I've thought about Eddie, about what I stole from him. He walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. I've had my lawyers draw up documents, a full confession with all the original correspondence, all the proof of what really happened. I've been carrying this guilt for half a century, and I can't take it to my grave. I want to make it right, but I don't know how. Eddie's name should be on every Wonderblock package. His picture should be in the Toy Hall of Fame, not mine. But I don't know if it's too late, if anyone would even care about correcting a 50-year-old injustice. I thought about my grandfather, sitting in his wheelchair, repeating this man's name like a mantra. His brilliant mind reduced to fragments, but somehow still holding on to this one truth, this one betrayal that had shaped his entire life. He remembers you, I said. Even with dementia, even when he can't remember my name or what he had for breakfast, He remembers Richard Hartwell. That's not confusion. That's his mind trying to tell us something important. What do you want me to do? I looked around the room, at the awards and accolades, at the empire built on my grandfather's stolen dreams. I want you to tell the truth, publicly. I want my grandfather's name restored to his invention before he dies. The company will fight it. The legal implications alone. I don't care about the legal implications. I don't want your money. I want justice. I want the world to know that Edward Morrison invented Wonder Blocks and that Richard Hartwell stole them. Hartwell nodded slowly. You're right. It's time. The press conference was scheduled for the following week. Hartwell's lawyers had tried to talk him out of it, warning about lawsuits and financial liability, but he had been firm. I'm dying anyway, he told them. What are they going to do? Sue a dead man? I spent those days gathering everything I could find about my grandfather's work. My mother helped me search through boxes in the garage, finding old sketches and prototypes that Eddie had saved. We discovered a notebook filled with his original designs for the interlocking mechanism, dated months before he'd met Hartwell. I remember this, my mother said, holding up a wooden prototype. Dad made this for me when I was 7. I played with it for hours, building castles and bridges. He was so proud of how the pieces fit together. We also found letters, correspondence between Eddie and various toy companies from the late 1970s and early 1980s, all rejections. Companies saying his designs were too similar to existing products or not commercially viable. Now I understood why. Hartwell had already flooded the market with Eddie's invention. The day of the press conference, I sat in the front row of the Hartwell Toys headquarters conference room, watching Richard Hartwell prepare to destroy his own legacy. He looked frail under the bright lights, older than his 83 years, but his voice was steady when he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I've called this press conference to correct a grave injustice that I've perpetrated for 50 years. The room was packed with reporters, toy industry executives, and Hartwell Toys employees. I could see the confusion on their faces as their CEO began to dismantle everything they thought they knew about their company's origin story. Wonder Blocks, the product that built this company and made me a billionaire, were not invented by me. They were created by a brilliant man named Edward Morrison, whom I betrayed in the worst possible way. Hartwell told the whole story: the partnership, the trust, the theft. He showed slides of Eddie's original sketches, read from the 1975 newspaper article, presented documentation that proved my grandfather was the true inventor of Wonder Blocks. Edward Morrison should be remembered as one of the great toy innovators of the 20th century. Instead, he lived his life in obscurity while I profited from his genius. This is my attempt to set the record straight, though I know it can never undo the harm I've caused. The questions from reporters were sharp, skeptical. Why was he admitting this now? What did he hope to gain? Was this some kind of publicity stunt? I'm dying, he said simply. I have perhaps 6 months to live. I don't want to take this secret to my grave. Edward Morrison deserves recognition for his work, and his family deserves to know the truth about what was stolen from them. When it was over, I approached the podium. Hartwell looked at me with eyes full of regret and something that might have been relief. Thank you, I said. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's all I can do. The story exploded across the media. Toy mogul admits to 50-year fraud. The stolen invention that built an empire. Wonder Blocks creator finally gets credit. The response was overwhelming. Toy collectors reached out, sharing stories of how Wonder Blocks had shaped their childhoods. Engineers and inventors praised my grandfather's innovative design. the Toy Industry Association announced they would be inducting Edward Morrison into their Hall of Fame posthumously. But the most important reaction came from my grandfather himself. I visited him the day after the press conference, bringing a tablet loaded with news articles about the revelation. I wasn't sure if he would understand, if his failing mind could process what had happened. "Grandpa," I said, sitting beside his wheelchair, "I found Richard Hartwell. I found out what he did to you." Grandpa Eddie looked at me with those cloudy blue eyes, and for a moment, I thought he didn't understand. Then he smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him in months. "Richard Hartwell," he said, but this time it wasn't an accusation or a desperate repetition. It was acknowledgement, recognition, peace. "Yes, Grandpa, Richard Hartwell, but everyone knows the truth now. Everyone knows you invented Wonder Blocks." He nodded slowly, and I saw something I hadn't seen in his face since the dementia began. Satisfaction. The burden he'd been carrying, the truth his failing mind had been trying to tell us, had finally been heard. Over the following weeks, as the story continued to make headlines, my grandfather's condition stabilized. He still had dementia, still forgot most things, but he stopped repeating Hartwell's name. The urgent, desperate quality that had driven him for months was gone. Richard Hartwell died 6 months later, as his doctors had predicted. His will included a substantial donation to Alzheimer's research in my grandfather's name, and he'd arranged for a scholarship fund for young inventors who couldn't afford to patent their ideas. My grandfather passed away, peacefully, 2 months after that on a Monday morning. His last words were to my mother, who was visiting. "Tell Sophie thank you." The funeral was larger than we'd expected. Toy designers, engineers, and inventors came to pay their respects to the man who'd created one of the most beloved toys in history. Wonderblocks packages now carry his name as the original inventor, and his picture hangs in the Toy Hall of Fame next to his original sketches. But for me, the most important moment came at the end, when we were cleaning out his room at Sunset Manor. In his nightstand drawer, I found a small wooden prototype, one of the original Wonder Blocks he'd carved by hand in his garage workshop 50 years ago. On the bottom, in his careful handwriting, were the words, "For Sophie's children and their children, build something beautiful." I held that block in my hands and thought about legacy, about truth, about the importance of fighting for justice, even when it comes too late to change a life. My grandfather never got to enjoy the recognition he deserved, never got to see his name in lights or his bank account filled with royalties. But he got something more important. He got to know in his final days that the truth had been told, that his granddaughter had fought for him, that his brilliant mind and generous heart had finally been recognized by the world. Sometimes justice is about money or punishment. Sometimes it's simply about setting the record straight, about making sure the right story gets told. My grandfather's legacy wasn't stolen after all. It was just waiting for someone to find it and bring it into the light. And now, every time I see a child playing with Wonder Blocks, building castles and bridges and impossible dreams, I know they're playing with my grandfather's imagination, his gift to the world, finally acknowledged, finally honored. The truth has a way of surfacing, even 50 years later, even when the only person who remembers it has a mind that's forgetting everything else. A powerful story about stolen dreams, family loyalty, and justice that comes just in time. What family story do you think deserves to be told? Share in the comments below. If this story of fighting for truth and honoring legacy moved you, please hit like and subscribe for more emotional stories about family, justice, and the power of never giving up. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.